Usually when we talk about signing a contract, there's this expectation of like absolute finality. I mean, think about a real estate closing.
Right. Yeah.
You sit at a giant table, you sign a stack of papers, the ink dries, and the lawyer just points at the document and says, there it is, deal done.
Exactly. It's entirely binary. The transaction is complete the moment the pen leaves the paper. You are either an owner or you're not.
Yeah, signature or no signature. It is incredibly clean.
And human beings love that. I mean, we crave for things to be settled. We want the comfort of being able to categorize our lives and our commitments with just a single verifiable action that we can, look back on.
But then you step into the world of ancient theology and human conviction, and suddenly that signed piece of paper just isn't enough. We're looking at a spiritual landscape today that demands a whole lot more from you than just a signature on a dotted line.
Which completely upends our modern desire for a quick transaction. When we look at these ancient texts, a commitment is the absolute definition of a living, breathing, continuous action.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today we are taking you right into the heart of what might be, well, the single most enduring, heavily debated question in all of Christian theology. How exactly does a person attain salvation? Is it by faith alone, or is it an indissoluble, unbreakable union of faith and works?
And this is not just some academic dispute. This specific tension is a question that has literally split empires, sparked reformations, and caused, frankly, centuries of division.
Yeah, it's massive. And to explore it, we have an incredibly dense, fascinating, scholarly theological essay in front of us titled Faith and Works, a biblical defense from the Epistle of James. But before we get to the authors, I want to frame why you, the listener, should care about this, even if you don't consider yourself a theologian or a religious person at all.
Right. The stakes are very human.
Exactly. The fundamental question we're unpacking today is whether simply saying you believe something is enough, or if true belief inherently requires physical action. That is a deeply human tension. I mean, we all navigate that gap between what we claim to value and what we actually do.
It is a universal human problem. And what makes our source material today so powerful is its uniquely multilingual approach.
Oh yeah, the scholar list on this is amazing.
It really is. The essay we're pulling from was authored and compiled by a diverse group of scholars who work across multiple ancient languages and scripts. We're looking at research from Frank Leo, who is also known as Lu Zongtang, Moshe Halevi, Franciscos Moises Lukitakis, and Moshe Levin.
Actually, there is only one author. All the names mentioned are the author's names in different languages.
So our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. We're going to unpack the original Greek, Hebrew, and Syriac texts of the Bible that these scholars have analyzed. We want to understand exactly what the ancient writers meant mechanically when they used the words faith and works.
And objectively, we're going to explore how this linguistic evidence challenges the famous doctrine of faith alone.
Right, and just to be clear up front, we are looking impartially at the linguistic evidence here. We aren't taking sides in the broader Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox debates. Okay, let's unpack this. Before we even get to the specific words in the book of James, I feel like we have to establish why this specific book caused such a huge uproar in the first place.
Well, you really can't separate the Epistle of James from the controversy surrounding Martin Luther.
The Reformation guy.
Yes. Luther, the great driver of the Protestant Reformation, championed the doctrine of sola fide, which is Latin for faith alone. He built his entire theological framework on the idea that justification before God comes through faith entirely apart from any human effort or works.
Okay, so I have to play devil's advocate here early on. If faith alone was Luther's absolute bedrock, how did he handle the book of James, which, seems to say the exact opposite?
He handled it by attacking it.
Oh, wow. Really?
Oh, yeah. Luther notoriously referred to the book of James as an epistle of straw.
Oh, no.
His native German, he called it a Strawhern epistle.
Epistle of straw. That's pretty harsh.
Very harsh. He used that derogatory term precisely because he felt James's teachings had no theological substance. To Luther, James was directly contradicting the central, shining truth of the Reformation.
But the scholars in our source material point out that James wasn't just like inventing a new rogue theology in a vacuum just to annoy people centuries later. He was building on a very old, deeply established foundation from the Old Testament. What did the essay say about where James was actually getting his definition of faith?
The essay takes us straight back to the book of Genesis, specifically Genesis 15.6. This is a crucial verse because defenders of the faith alone position use it constantly. The verse reads, Abraham believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness.
Right, and on the surface, at least in English, it sounds like a purely mental event. Abraham just believed a fact, and boom, he was justified.
But I'm guessing the original Hebrew doesn't treat believing as just, nodding your head to a factual statement.
Far from it. The original Hebrew root used for the word believe is mer-en. And linguistically, this root does not mean a one-time mental agreement.
What does it mean, though?
Wait, I should say, the expert analysis shows it implies the physical act of standing firm. It carries the deep connotation of an ongoing, committed reliance.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, in fact, when ancient Jewish scholars translated that Hebrew text into the Greek Septuagint, they chose a Greek verb that likewise implies a deep, active entrustment of oneself to someone else.
I like to think about this Hebrew root, this mer, kind of like a marriage vow. It's not just the intellectual act of standing at an altar, looking at someone and saying, I do, one time.
Right.
Because if you say I do and then totally ignore your partner for the next 10 years, no one would say you're acting married.
No, definitely not.
The vow is the ongoing act of trust. It's the physical reality of actually being married every single day, making the compromises, doing the dishes, showing up. The daily actions don't replace the vow. They are the living proof of the vow.
That analogy captures the mechanics perfectly. The intellectual agreement is merely the starting line. And the source points out that the faith described in Genesis 15 finds its ultimate physical completion chapters later in Genesis 22.
Right, when Abraham takes the unimaginable action of being willing to offer his son Isaac on the altar.
Exactly. The faith and the action are part of the same continuous arc. And we see this exact same active requirement in the Shema found in Deuteronomy 6.
Okay, the Shema is basically the foundational creed of Israel, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
Yes, exactly. And it immediately commands the people to love God. But when we look at the Hebrew word for loving God, hanta, it is never presented as just a warm, fuzzy internal emotion.
It's an action.
Yes, in the context of the ancient Near East, loving a sovereign was an active covenantal commitment. It was a political and spiritual loyalty expressed exclusively through obedience and action.
Wait, so if James is essentially just repeating Old Testament ideas about action and covenant that had already been around for centuries, why did Luther have such a massive problem with this specific letter?
Because James takes that active, demanding Old Testament definition of faith and he uses it as a scalpel. He performs this harsh, uncompromising diagnosis of any faith that lacks that action.
Ah, I see.
This moves us from the historical context into a literal linguistic autopsy of James chapter 2.
Okay, let's dive into that autopsy. How exactly does James tear down the idea of an inactive faith?
Well, the expert analysis shows he starts in James chapter 2, verse 14, with a piercing question. After describing someone who claims to have faith but does nothing to help people in need, James asks, can that faith save him?
In English, that sounds like an open question, like he's pondering, I wonder if it can.
But in the original Koine Greek, it is anything but open. The text uses a very specific grammatical construction, mamai denatai.
Okay, what does that signify?
Well, in Greek syntax, when a speaker starts a question with the particle mo, it is a rhetorical device that linguistically demands a negative answer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the grammar itself forces the reader to say, no, absolutely not. James is asserting a negative fact, not hosting a debate.
So the original language literally bakes the no right into the question. That's fascinating. What did the scholars find when they looked at how other ancient communities translated that verse?
The Syriac Peshitta, which is an incredibly important early translation of the Bible, reveals something pretty amazing here. When translating that rhetorical question, the Syriac text doesn't just use a standard word for save.
What do they use?
It intensifies the verb to give him life, which is tataiwai.
Whoa, that changes the entire landscape.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, because we aren't just talking about a generic, distant concept of going to heaven anymore. By asking, can that faith give him life? James is literally saying that without action, faith has no life-giving power whatsoever.
The stakes are absolute. An inactive faith fails to convey life itself, which leads us to the grim diagnosis in James 2.17, where he concludes that faith without works is dead.
Dead. Let's look at the exact words the ancient writers used for that because, in modern English, we use the word dead pretty loosely.
Right, like a dead battery.
Exactly, or a joke is dead. What are the original Greek and Syriac words?
In Greek, the word James uses is nekra. In the Syriac text, the word is mia. And both of those words carry a very specific visceral weight. They do not mean weak. They don't mean incomplete or less effective or dormant.
They literally mean a corpse.
A literal corpse, a body devoid of breath. It possesses zero life, zero power, and zero capacity to act in the world.
It makes me think of a store mannequin. I mean, a mannequin possesses the exact outward shape, the exact proportions, and the visual appearance of a human being.
Right.
If you see one in a dark room, you might genuinely think it's a person. But it completely lacks the animating spirit inside. It can't speak, it can't move, it can't love. It is completely inert.
James is applying that exact image to the human soul. A faith without works might have the outward appearance of trusting God. It might know all the right religious vocabulary. But intrinsically, mechanically, it is a mannequin. It's nekra.
Okay, so if a dead faith is just intellectual agreement without action, just knowing the facts and saying yes to a theological quiz, who actually possesses this kind of faith?
That is the million-dollar question, because the text gives an answer that is honestly shocking.
It's a rhetorically devastating moment. James writes, "You believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder."
Demons. He compares intellectual faith to the faith of demons.
He does. And the Greek in James 2.19 is very deliberate. The word used for the demons believing is pisteusin. That is the exact same verb used throughout the New Testament for human faith.
Hold on, are you telling me the demons have perfect orthodox theology? They know the facts. They mentally assent to the Shema.
They absolutely do. They know exactly who God is. They have zero theological confusion. But look at what their correct theology produces.
What does it produce?
It doesn't produce obedience and it doesn't produce love. It produces sheer terror. The Greek word used for their reaction is phrysusin, and the Syriac equivalent is rolin.
Shuddering, right.
Yes, it describes a visceral, involuntary shuddering, the paralyzing dread of an animal trapped in a corner.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. So, if demons have perfect theology, and they mentally agree with the correct propositions, but they have no works, does the text imply that having the correct doctrine is actually completely useless on its own?
It demonstrates what philosophers would call taking an argument to its absurd logical extreme.
Okay, how so?
If faith alone, understood simply as mental agreement to correct facts, were genuinely sufficient for salvation, then James is pointing out that the demons would be first in line for heaven. Their theology is flawless.
Wow.
It is a complete dismantling of the idea that intellectual assent equals salvation.
So if demons just mentally agree and shudder in terror, what does James think actual human faith is supposed to look like? Does he give us a real-world alternative?
He pivots immediately back to Abraham in verses 20 through 22. James contrasts this demonic, terrified faith with the lived faith of Abraham offering Isaac. And to explain how this works mechanically, he introduces a beautiful Greek word, synergai.
That sounds suspiciously like our English word synergy.
It is the exact origin of the word. It means to work together with. James is telling his readers that faith and works are collaborative agents. They are not rivals fighting for the spotlight. They're not two different paths. They operate in synergy.
And what's the actual result of that synergy?
The text says that through works, faith is perfected. The Greek verb here is eteleshte, and the Syriac uses egemrai. It doesn't mean fixing a flaw. It means bringing something to maturity or bringing it to its proper intended end.
It's like reaching its full potential.
Exactly. The Syriac roots here literally evoke the image of two hands laboring together on the same task. The faith guides the works, and the physical works actualize and complete the faith.
Having established that purely intellectual faith is essentially demonic, James moves in for the decisive blow in chapter 2, verse 24. This is the verse that I imagine gave Martin Luther nightmares.
It really is the climax of his argument. James writes, "You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone."
Let's look incredibly closely at that phrase, not by faith alone.
The original Greek phrase is ouk ek pistes monon. From a purely linguistic standpoint, this is the only place in the entire Bible where the words faith and alone appear side by side.
The only place.
The singular occurrence. And James places them side by side explicitly to deny their sufficiency.
Now, in the spirit of looking at this objectively, our source essay outlines a common counter-argument from modern defenders of the faith alone position. I want to throw this at you.
Sure, go for it.
The counter-argument usually says that when James uses the word justified, he just means shown to be righteous before human beings, like demonstrating your faith to onlookers. Whereas when the Apostle Paul uses the word justified, he meant declared righteous before God. How does the text handle that?
It's a very common attempt to resolve the tension, but the scholarly essay dismantles this by demanding we look at the surrounding context. You have to go back to verse 14, where James opened the argument. He framed this entire discussion around the ultimate rescue of the soul. The Greek word used there is susai, to save. He asked, can that faith save him?
Right. He didn't ask, can that faith make him look like a really good neighbor to the people next door?
Exactly. The context is ultimate salvation. Furthermore, think back to the autopsy metaphor. If this were merely about an outward demonstration for human onlookers, the life or death stakes of his argument would be completely out of proportion.
Because you wouldn't call someone a corpse just for bad PR?
You don't compare someone to a rotting corpse just because they aren't adequately showing off their theology to their friends. The text is about eternal life, not just generating evidence for a jury.
So what does this all mean for the classic Paul versus James debate? Because they both use the exact same Greek word for justified, which is dikaitai. Are the defenders of faith alone just trying to force two different texts to agree when linguistically they simply don't?
The linguistic evidence presented by the scholars suggests that reading a purely demonstrative meaning into James's use of the word justify is a massive stretch. It requires bending the Greek language to fit a preconceived theological framework rather than letting the text speak for itself.
And James caps off this entire chapter with what might be his ultimate analogy in verse 26, tying everything back to the human body.
He states that the relationship between works and faith is exactly like the spirit animating a body. The Greek words he uses are pneuma for spirit or breath and summa for body. In the Syriac translation, it is ruth and po.
So works are the divine breath, and faith is the physical clay body.
That is the profound inversion James makes. We often think of faith as the invisible spiritual part. But James says faith is the body. The Syriac word ru is incredibly evocative here because it's a direct cognate to the ancient Hebrew word used in the Genesis creation story for the breath of life.
Oh, wow.
Without works, faith is just formed clay. It might look like a belief system, but it has no breath. It cannot inhale. It cannot live.
If James is so explicit and uncompromising about this synergy, we have to ask the obvious question. Is he a lone wolf in the New Testament? Is James the only writer making these demands, or is he actually singing in a chorus with the rest of the biblical authors?
The essay points out that he is very much part of a wider chorus. If you look closely at the language, the rest of the New Testament echoes this exact same synergy.
Let's look at the words of Jesus himself in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Jesus draws a stark contrast between the person who merely says, Lord, Lord, and the person who actually does the will of the Father.
The linguistic contrast there is between the Greek holegen, the one who merely speaks, and hopoion, the one who acts. But here is where the multi-language approach of the essay uncovers something brilliant in the Syriac text.
I love this part. Break down the Syriac connection for us.
In the ancient Syriac translation of Matthew 7, the specific word Jesus uses for doing the will of the Father is hush. Now, if you track how the Syriac translators handle the book of James, the word James uses repeatedly for works is hush.
Wait, they share the exact same root?
The exact same linguistic root. So what James is calling works is simply the noun form of the very action Jesus is demanding when he commands his followers to do the will of the Father.
That's incredible.
They aren't different concepts. James is just providing the mechanical explanation for Jesus's core demand.
And it isn't just Jesus. We also have to look at the Apostle Paul, who is, the epicenter of the faith alone argument.
Right. Look at Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. Paul writes directly to the believers and gives them a command to work out their salvation with fear and trembling.
I have to stop you there because the irony is just dripping off that verse. Paul is the very apostle that most historical theologians rely upon to defend the concept of faith alone. Yet here he is using commanding, imperative language, telling his followers to physically work out their own salvation. How does that reconcile?
The Greek word Paul uses is katergeses, which means to bring about or produce through effort. But Paul immediately follows that command by saying, for it is God who is at work in you.
Oh.
He reconciles it by showing that grace and human effort are not mutually exclusive. They are not enemies. God provides the grace, the fuel, and the calling, but the human being must expend the effort to walk the path. It matches James's concept of synergy flawlessly.
So, bringing all of this historical, linguistic, and theological evidence together, how does the essay conclude this deep dive into faith and works?
The scholars conclude by synthesizing the reality that grace is undeniably the unearned source of salvation, but that grace actively calls forth a human response. to put it metaphorically. Faith is the door, but works are the physical act of walking through it.
I like that.
Faith is the seed planted in the soil, but works are the harvest that actually feeds people. To try and separate works from faith is to reduce a vibrant, lived reality into a dead intellectual proposition.
And for you listening, this deep dive is really a masterclass in how to read ancient texts closely. It reminds us that when we take catchy slogans, even historically massive ones like faith alone, and isolate them from their original linguistic context, we can obscure the demanding, synergistic reality of what those ancient writers were actually trying to tell us.
The linguistic evidence across Greek, Hebrew, and Syriac consistently points away from a passive intellectual agreement. It constantly pushes the reader toward an active, lived, physical commitment.
Which brings us right back to that real estate contract we talked about at the beginning of the show. In the realm of the soul, and in the realm of deep human conviction, there is no such thing as a deal done with just a signature. The ink never really dries because the contract demands to be lived out, proven, and actualized every single day.
It requires the breath of physical action to give the ink life.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over today, stepping outside the bounds of ancient theology and looking directly at your own everyday life. If true belief is inherently inseparable from physical action, if faith without works is literally a corpse, how might this change the way you evaluate your own core convictions? Whether it's your political stances, your deepest personal values, or the promises you make to the people you love. Well, what if the hard truth is that you only actually believe the things you actively do?